Good morning, and can I welcome everyone to the 16th meeting of 2020 of the Social Security Committee. Apologies this morning has been received from Shona Robson MSP, and I'm pleased to see we've got James Dornan MSP attending in her place. So James, you are more than welcome. And I move to agenda item 1, decision on taking business in private. And the committee has asked you to agree that item 3, consideration of the evidence we're about to hear this morning, and item 4 on engagement planning are taken in private. Now, given the complexities of the group discussion over video conferencing, I'll assume that everyone is agreed unless anyone indicates anything in the chat box that I'm looking at currently. So just give a few seconds for that. Okay, we are agreed, and we now move to agenda item 2 on Scottish Child Payment. The committee will take evidence in the Scottish Child Payment regulations. And can I welcome Morag Green, Strategic Lead, Social Justice Citizens Advice Scotland, and Baldock, Financial Inclusion Team Leader, One Parent Families Scotland, and John Shaw, Welfare Rights Advisor, Child Poverty Action Group. Can I remind members and witnesses to keep their questions as succinct as they possibly can, given the time constraints we're under and the platform that we're meeting under, to wait a couple of seconds when I call you to make sure the camera and the microphone gets to you. Now, I'll maybe just open up a brief question for context first of all. Now, I think we can all agree that the policy intent behind the Scottish Child Payment regulations are welcome. And my second question will be looking at eligibility, but I suppose my first question for context is the Fiscal Commission estimates that we've had on spending on the Scottish Child Payment. So in the financial year 2020 to 2021, that'll be £11 million, but £77 million for the first full financial year for those eligible under 6. That could be up to 194,000 children that would benefit £10 per child per week. So that's the context, and of course that's before we look at, unfortunately, the economic crisis that's looming due to COVID-19. So I wonder, and I don't think I need all the witnesses to comment on this, if one of the witnesses would want to set in context what they think the impact would be of that money being paid to young people or to those households. And I will look at eligibility for my second question. So for this first question, what do you think the benefits or the impact that payment will have? We'll maybe take John Shaw from Child Poverty Action Groups to set the scene, and then my follow-up will be on eligibility.
Okay, good morning, and thanks for the opportunity to give evidence today. I think our press release summarises it as a game changer, and it certainly will make a significant difference to families with children under 6 across Scotland. I think it's also perhaps worth noting that it's not a game winner. The IPPR Scotland and JRF analysis before the COVID crisis described this as a policy which would slow the projected increase in child poverty, paying £10 a week per family. So we certainly think that there's going to be more to do and other levers to pull as well. So we absolutely welcome the policy, but we think that it needs to be kept under review in terms of the extent of the contribution to meeting those child poverty targets.
Absolutely. Does any other witness want to comment before I move on to eligibility? Okay, thank you. Now, I was looking at some of the SCOS recommendations in regarding the Scottish Child Payment, and the Scottish Government responded positively to some of them, but where they've not felt the ability to respond was in relation to those young people under 6 who will initially receive the benefit, but then when they become 6, will then drop off for a short period of time, and the unintended consequences around that. Now, the Scottish Government has cited issues with getting data from DWP in terms of being able to make that happen. I just wonder if any of our witnesses this morning, given this is something you were very keen to see happen, is not to have that withdrawn for a short period of time, would like to comment on that. I see John Shaw has indicated, but I'll take John Shaw and then I'll take Morag after that.
Thank you. So I think it's looking at the Scottish Government response to SCOS, it's quite clear that there's acknowledgement that different approaches might be possible, but those have been rejected on the grounds that the data won't be available from DWP, as you've said, Convener. And I suppose it's worth probing that a bit more with the Cabinet Secretary, perhaps, because it feels a little bit like it's making the perfect the enemy of the good. Because across Scotland, we have local authorities and even colleges who are awarding financial support to people.
These comments are the appeal back.
Sorry, I'm not sure if I should carry on here.
John, I'll tell you what, we'll take Morag Green in and I'll bring you back in, John. Just your connection was sticking there for a little bit, so we'll take Morag in and I will bring you back in, John. Morag Green.
Thanks very much, and I think the first thing to say is that Citizens Advice very much welcomes the Scottish Child Payment, and we think it will make a very kind of positive impact on the families that it is paid to. We are concerned about the fact that only children under 6 will be eligible in the first instance, and I think we anticipate that being quite problematic for families where the child turns 6 and they lose that income, because obviously it won't be an insignificant amount of money for those families. And we're also worried about the fact that further down the line, when that child becomes eligible for the benefit, that the family will need to reapply. So we think that there will need to be kind of crystal clear communications around the eligibility for this payment, because it is particularly complex. I think on the kind of issue about the kind of data transfer, this is something that we have kind of discussed with Scottish Government, and we have made clear to them that we would like to see it resolved as quickly as possible. It feels like they have explored a number of different avenues, but what we would ask is that once the payment is in place, that they continue to pursue the DWP and other avenues to get the payments to older children up and running as soon as practicable.
That's very helpful, Morag. I should point out that I understand John Shaw's connection was fine. It may have been my connection sitting in the Scottish Parliament that there was an issue with, so I apologise for that, John. The good old Scottish Parliament connectivity. John, I will not interrupt you as you make this contribution, and I'll let you know, John Shaw.
Thank you. So yeah, I think the point I was making is that it appears to have been rejected to require people to provide evidence of their entitlement to a qualifying benefit, which is the approach which is used across Scotland by colleges processing EMA applications, local authorities looking at free school meals, and the Scottish Government response rejects this on grounds of administrative cost and also risk. So I think it would be really interesting to know more about what the level of cost foreseen is, because there is a really nice ability to upload evidence to mygov.scot, which is already in place, and the regulations clearly allow Scottish ministers to place a duty on individuals to notify a change in their circumstances, such as a qualifying benefit stopping. And as we know, the Cabinet Secretary said she's not willing to introduce the Scottish child payment until she has the ability to prosecute for fraud. So there's clearly the tools there available to safeguard the system, even if this bulk data transfer is not in place. And it's quite clear the Scottish Government has decided against that, but they could probably do with a bit more detail about why, I think.
Thank you, John. Now, before I bring Keith Brown in, can I just check whether Anne Baldock's got anything to add?
Thanks very much. The OPFS, like my colleagues here, are more than happy that the Scottish Child Payment is being brought forward. However, we do have deep concern about parents who will get the payment for a short period of time and then it stops. Parents get used to a weekly income and budget accordingly. If they're given money and then it's taken away, it could actually cause indirectly more problems for them, because they're just getting used to budgeting in one system and then their money's cut. And lone parents, every single penny is taken into account on a week-to-week basis. So it'll be very difficult for them to understand how they will get money and then it being taken away. We would like to see a transitional payment being put into place, if nothing else, that would safeguard this for these parents.
Thank you, Anne. And that's something we can obviously raise with the Cabinet section. We get the opportunity about the practicalities of whether that is or isn't possible. Keith Brown, can I take you in now?
Thanks, Convener. Just to explore this a bit further, I mean, I'm looking at the information that I've got, and I understand the Scottish Government are reluctant, not just because they won't get the data from DWP, but also from HMRC, which they also rely on. And they've said that they think, apart from the reputational and audit risks that are involved, there's also the fact that we've contravened the Scottish Public Finance Manual, which is quite a serious issue for the government. So I suppose I'm really wondering whether, and we can obviously explore it further with the Cabinet Secretary, whether the witnesses think this is, I seem to get the flavour the Scottish Government is saying this in order to avoid doing it, whereas for me it seems a very good reason. So I suppose the question really is whether the benefit of introducing the payment now is worth the trade-off of waiting to extend eligibility to children under 16, and to go back to Anne Baldock's point, whether that disruption for some parents inevitably is an issue that is perhaps worth having to take on in order to make this payment as soon as possible and try and help families. So is it worth that trade-off, really, is what I'd ask the witnesses.
So, I see Anne Baldock was mentioned there. Do you want to come in there, Anne?
I think it's a hard one. I think the trade-off is still worth it, because anything that comes in earlier that will support the majority of parents has to be worth it. But I still think there should be the ability to safeguard both, just mainly down to practicalities, as we've talked about. So bringing the system in, great, but I think it's not exhausted yet, looking at how the Scottish Government get the data that they need.
Thank you, Anne. I'll take John Shaw, then I'll take Morag.
So just on the narrow HMRC point, I think it's important to note that the tax credit system is an annualised income assessment, so that effectively is much more stable than universal credit. And obviously there could still be issues if somebody is no longer responsible for a child in the award notice they've provided to Social Security Scotland, for example. But as I said in my previous answer, I think that the regulations are very clear that a duty to notify of a change in responsibility for a child can be placed on individuals. And the other point to make, I think, on this is, I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary will confirm, is that benefit fraud, particularly by individuals rather than organised, is very, very rare indeed. And it's about that balance of reduction in child poverty, getting money to families sooner, set against what's, in terms of the wider social security system, we know is a very, very small risk of fraudulent claims, where indeed the Cabinet Secretary has taken powers to be able to deal with that. And I'm not an expert in the public finance manual, but certainly there are the tools there available to deal with any claims which are made on an incorrect basis and seek to recover that money.
Morag Green?
Yeah, I don't have much to add to what my colleagues have already said, but I suppose CAS's position is that the kind of sooner this payment can get into the pockets of the people who need it, the better. And I don't think that it's kind of worth delaying till the kind of tail end of 2022 in order to kind of have the eligibility in place for everyone. So I think if I think that all avenues should be explored for reaching the older children in the first instance, but if that can't be achieved, then it shouldn't delay the rollout of the benefit for the under 6.
Okay. Keith Brown, do you want to come back before I move to theme 2 and Rachael Hamilton?
I won't take up any more time, Kim, just to make a request of the witnesses, not so much for a response just now, to say that I'm kind of getting the flavour that maybe some of the witnesses think the Scottish Government is, if not making excuses, making too much of the reasons why they feel they can't address this. Personally, I think it's a very serious thing if ministers go beyond the Scottish Public Finance Manual. It's a very serious matter, and opposition parties in the Parliament would certainly want to question them on that. And also, I think the reputation of a benefit is extremely important, and once it's lost and undermined, you can see what's happened with previous Westminster benefits. It's very hard to regain. But if the witnesses have got any further arguments that we could use when we speak to the Cabinet Secretary that maybe could push them further, or push DWP further to try and get underneath this, I'm happy to ask them. But thanks to the witnesses for the responses so far.
Mr. Brown, I might just let the witnesses back in if they want, given the nature of your comment there. I don't think I heard anyone suggesting that there wasn't an absolute commitment from the Scottish Government to deliver this, and that the issue around 6-year-olds was a consequence of fast-tracking the Scottish child payment, which we're now trying to together as a Parliament resolve if possible. So, I mean, I think they might, I've got words in their mouth, they might want to put that on the record, unless there's something I'm not seeing here. Don't feel the need to. Morag Green?
Yeah, I mean, I've already said that we've had extensive discussions with the Scottish Government on this point and other points, and the sense that I get is that civil servants and the Minister have worked quite hard to explore the kind of issues around this and the opportunities. So yeah, I think to me it looks like the kind of most obvious way forward is to push the DWP to transfer this data quickly, but obviously we know from working with them too that they're also under kind of massive stress at the moment. Other organisations will have other kind of expertise on it, but yeah, my view is that the Scottish Government have been working hard to resolve this if at all possible.
That's very helpful, and I'm just giving a wee second just in the chat box just in case another witness wants to come in. Do not feel obliged to, it's just the offer's there if you wish to come in. Anne?
I would agree with Morag, which has just said. We appreciate the amount of commitment that the Scottish Government have made to this. So we do work quite closely with the Scottish Government regarding some of the testing and everything else that's going on, and we've seen the commitment that they've got to it. But we are just pointing out, from our perspective, how we think things could be improved, but it's not a reflection on the commitment of the Scottish Government to bring the payment in. We welcome the payment being brought in as soon as possible.
And thank you for putting that on the record, and we absolutely appreciate it's the job of One Parent Families Scotland to push for the vulnerable families you represent. Thank you for putting that on the record. John Shaw, and then we will move to Rachael. Thank you for your patience, Rachael Hamilton. John Shaw.
Yeah, absolutely. We echo the comments, and we certainly think that introducing the payment as soon as possible for under 6s is fantastic. I think, yeah, the only thing to add really is just to reiterate there's no suggestion that there isn't the political will to spend that money if the data was available for under 16s. So if the Cabinet Secretary's view is that balance of risk and reward is just not right for the Scottish child payment, it should also be borne in mind that before 2022 there are many other levers available to the Scottish Government which can be used to provide financial support for under 16s other than the Scottish child payment, which will also contribute to reducing child poverty.
That's very helpful, Mr. Shaw, particularly helpful as we look towards budget scrutiny as a committee as well. So thank you for putting that on the record. Rachael Hamilton.
Hey panel, and thanks for joining us. The theme I want to discuss is uprating, and we know that to help low-income families, we need to ensure that the Scottish Child Payment keeps up with the cost of living. So that would mean following or exploring some of the recommendations from CPAG and the Poverty Alliance by bringing an amendment in at stage 3, which would mean a double lock, which would mean increasing the payment by the higher earnings growth or indeed the rate of inflation. So I really wanted to ask all the panel whether they agree with the Scottish Government that they argue that the cost of uprating would have a significant impact on the Scottish budget. What is your opinion on that? And do you believe that their approach to uprating is sufficient and clear? That's to all the panel.
Okay, and just a little housekeeping note for the panel. Thank you very much. I can see a request to speak coming in the chat box now. That's very helpful for myself chairing the meeting. Anne?
I think the need for uprating does prove that the cost is a cost that needs to be borne. To make the payment that will address the aims of it to help reduce poverty and provide funds that are needed. So I think that the Scottish Government are putting up the amendment, and it should help if the payment is uprated as they suggest. I would also say that the initial £10 payment, while it's more than welcome, sadly over the last couple of years costs have gone up considerably, and from the very start it won't provide as much as it was originally intended to do.
Thank you, Anne. John Shaw.
Thank you. We know the Cabinet Secretary is proposing to amend the current bill at stage 3 to introduce a duty to uprate Scottish child payment. I think a couple of points on that are that we're disappointed there's no plan to uprate it from April 2021. Obviously, this bill has to pass in order to be able to uprate the Scottish child payment, so it will certainly be in time. We think the scope for a transitional uprating provision, even if the standard rule can't work. I think picking up on Anne's point about the adequacy of £10 a week, I think it's also important to note that it may be necessary to go beyond the increase in prices. Certainly, I cited that Joseph Rantry research as suggesting that £10 a week will slow the increase in child poverty. So at the point where the funds and the political will are available, it's really going to be important for there to be a possibility of going beyond an increase in prices in order to really change the game and bring down child poverty rates. On the point of the cost of increase in the Scottish child payment, I think absolutely it will represent an impact on the Scottish budget, but the other side of that question is what's the impact on the other areas of the Scottish budget of not taking action on child poverty? This is an investment in the people of Scotland, and failing to make that investment places costs on other areas of the Scottish budget. So I think you need to compare those two things. And finally, there's also in the SCOS response, it talks about the confusion and complexity of different indexations. And I suppose it's potentially worth noting, I'm not sure how many members are aware of this, but various UK benefits are uprated using various different indexation measures. I'm not aware of it causing any confusion to claimants. Nobody, as far as I know, looks at the changes to two payments and says, well, this one's gone up by 1.7%, but this one's gone up by 2.5%. It's difficult to see how that's going to create any confusion. It's merely going to be a matter of telling the Fiscal Commission which measure you want them to forecast the expenditure on, as I see it.
Thank you, John. Do you want to come back on that, Rachel?
I just wondered if Morag had any comments at all on that point about uprating.
Morag?
Yeah, so Citizens Advice Scotland supports uprating of benefits generally, so that they don't kind of lose their real value over time. We haven't kind of called specifically for the benefit to be uprated from next year, but like I can absolutely kind of see the kind of value in CPAG's argument behind that and the kind of methods that they've kind of proposed for taking that forward. And we had in our submission to the committee said that we would like to see the double lock increase for kind of subsequent years.
Thank you, Maura. Go ahead, Rachel.
No, I was just saying that everyone's answered my questions, and so that's enough for me. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Alison Johnstone.
Thank you, Convener, and apologies for arriving slightly late this morning. And thank you to our witnesses. The Scottish social security system has to contribute to reducing poverty. That is on the face of the Act. So I'd just like to ask our witnesses to what extent you think that current £10 limit will enable that. I mean, and John Shaw touched on the case for considering a higher rate, and I noticed that Plaid Cymru are considering a £30 payment for Wales.
John Shaw, I think you were specifically mentioned there. Do you want to come in?
Sure. Unfortunately, I already used my quote. So it's the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, IPPR Scotland, before COVID, saying that the £10 a week is predicted to slow the increase in child poverty. So obviously, £10 a week is an important contribution to slowing that projected rise in child poverty. But to reiterate, we haven't seen anything suggesting that £10 a week or £10 a week uprated for CPI is going to meet those child poverty targets without more action, whether that's through increased Scottish child payment or using other levers at the Scottish Government's disposal.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously there's been quite a gap. There's been quite considerable time between when the idea of £10 child payment was proposed and the first payment date. So is it your view that there's an argument, therefore, to, at a minimum, set the payment at a rate that recognises that there have been several years of inflation since the policy was proposed?
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Absolutely, and I think that comes back to the Minister's proposed amendment to the Tribunals Bill. We would absolutely support these regulations being passed with £10 a week, but we are moving into the budget process now, and I think that this is the time to have that conversation to make sure that it's possible, if there is the political will and the budget permits, to go beyond indexation and to increase it from April 2021, bearing in mind that this proposal was made several years ago.
Can I ask another question, Convener?
I think Anne Baldock wants to come in, and then we'll take you for another question after that, Alison.
Thank you.
I would just like to say I agree with everything that John said there. I think we see it as this first payment is the thing that will start the whole system rolling. So any uprating from that is from that first payment. So that first payment has to be able to do what it intends to do. And then you can look at subsequent uprating, but it's that first payment that starts, and it has to achieve what it's meant to achieve. And sadly, because of the problems with inflation over the last couple of years, it won't do as much as it was originally proposed to do.
Thank you. Can I ask, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation have made a large number of recommendations for improving the child payment, and two of these are that we should provide backdating of the payment to to families who weren't aware of their entitlement, so that payments would be backdated before the date of application, perhaps by a few months. And the other one was to allow the child payment to run on for 3 months after eligibility ends, to avoid that sudden cliff edge in income that I think Anne Baldock was mentioning earlier. Do you think these would be improvements on the current design?
Anne, given you were mentioned, do you want to come in there and take Morag after that?
I think the idea of having a run-on to try and sort of mitigate would be a good idea. The only thing is it might be very difficult to do that, where you would maybe have a switch in claiming the payment. Say, for example, the husband was making a claim and getting the money, and then they split up and the wife moves to then make the claim as a single parent. Technically, if there's a run-on of benefit, you're getting paid at the same time, because you couldn't deny the second claimant the ability to receive the payment. It's a long way of saying things, but you know what I mean. So it would be very welcome, but I think it would be difficult to try and administer.
Thank you.
Okay, Morag Green.
Yeah, so the run-on issue is something that we have had discussions with Scottish Government about, because it's something that we think is particularly important in the context of mitigating some of the impacts of universal credit that we see on the people that use the cab service. And basically the way that universal credit works, and the kind of the monthly assessment periods, which don't always align with the way that people are paid, because obviously universal credit is an in-work benefit as well. So what can happen is, because the assessment period doesn't necessarily align with the way that people are paid, some months universal credit claimants can end up receiving no payment from universal credit, and in those circumstances the Scottish Child Payment would also stop. And we had hoped that a run-on would be possible, so that on those kind of odd months where there is no income from universal credit, the Scottish Child Payment would provide a mitigating payment. Our understanding from discussions with Scottish Government is that that's not legally possible, and that they can't actually achieve that they can only pay Scottish Child Payment when universal credit is also in payment. But it's something that we'd kind of said in our submission that we'd like the Scottish Government to monitor the impact of that, the kind of variable nature of universal credit payments, particularly for people in work, and consider the ways in which that can be mitigated either by the Scottish Child Payment or in other ways.
Thank you. And we'll get John Shaw want to come in as well. Alison, John Shaw.
So we mentioned in our submission that we're disappointed that there's no power to backdate Scottish Child Payment applications. It's also worth pointing out that some of the qualifying benefits can be backdated 3 months without any need to show reason for a late claim. So somebody who becomes aware of their entitlement to both would be able to backdate a claim for a qualifying benefit, but the Scottish Child Payment would start from the date of application, and that seems to be a simple policy choice. In terms of the run-on, we've had similar discussions to Morag, and absolutely agree, using the current delivery mechanism of a Section 79 top-up, there is simply no power to pay a Scottish Child Payment when the qualifying benefit is ended. And I think this probably points towards the review and thinking about whether there's a case for making the legal basis of the Scottish Child Payment different, even if the delivery mechanism remains identical. Because if it was, for example, to be converted into a new type of assistance under the Act, that would allow the payment to continue during gaps in universal credit entitlement. Indeed, it would potentially allow for a payment to be made for children whose parents are simply ineligible for any social security benefits at all, but whose financial circumstances are similar to those who get means tested benefits.
Alison, I'm going to have to move on if that's okay. My apologies.
No, that's fine, convener. Thank you.
Okay, now Tom Arthur wanted a supplementary on this. You've not had the opportunity to come in yet, Tom. Do you have a supplementary in this area?
I do. Thank you very much, convener. I'm grateful for the opportunity to ask a short supplementary on the area of uprating. Just to give some context to what I'm about to say, I absolutely recognise and support the principle that social security is an investment in people of Scotland, and I very much think that for the relative short-term investment of over something such as Scottish Child Payment, the long-term benefits will be significant. So I'm very sympathetic to the calls for a strengthened uprating mechanism, and perhaps for the Scottish Child Payment is introduced next year, for that to reflect the level of inflation that has taken place since the policy was first proposed. However, we operate within a very tight fiscal settlement within Scotland, and the capacity of the Scottish Parliament to borrow is strictly limited by the fiscal framework, and this necessitates very difficult budget decisions. Now, I was interested in some of the remarks that John made in particular. I would be keen to hear from all members of the panel. I'm not asking you to set the Scottish budget, but as we enter budget negotiations, if we are to give effect to that policy that you desire of perhaps increasing Scottish Child Payment initially, that will necessitate taking money from other budgets, either within social security or within other portfolios. What values do you think should inform these discussions? I'm not even asking you to necessarily identify particular portfolios where money should be removed from or taken from, but what values do you think should inform these discussions? Are there areas of the Scottish budget, for example, that you think can afford to be deprioritised to add an emphasis to the priority of Scottish Child Payment and social security more generally?
Just before witnesses come in and answer that question, I thank Tom Arthur, not necessarily because of the content, because of using the word budget. We've got an ongoing budget scrutiny process all year round. So we have to look at calls in the context of the budget that will be awarded to social security, things like carers allowance supplement, best start grants, young carers grants, and of course this particular new benefit which came from the Give Me 5 campaign, universal, and is now £10, so double the original campaign, but actually targeted rather than universal. And as our committee grapples with budget scrutiny in the months ahead, your comments will help inform that. Hope you don't mind me saying that, Tom, but I think that's the context by which we have to work committee sessions in relation to budget scrutiny. Does anyone want to come in and make a comment on that, which the committee would find helpful for budget scrutiny for sure? Thank you, John Shaw. John.
I suppose I'm going to tread very, very carefully because I have zero expertise and limited knowledge of any area of the Scottish budget outside social security. But I'm here representing Child Poverty Action Group, and I think from our perspective, there can be no more important use of the Scottish budget than making inroads into child poverty. So, absolutely, this should be top of the priority list when it comes to making budgetary decisions, but I'm afraid I have nothing further to add on which other portfolios should be the trade-off with that.
That's always the difficult bit, Mr. Shaw, isn't it? Morag Green.
I'm not going to comment on where the trade-off should be, but I just wanted to make sure that the committee was aware of the approach of human rights budgeting that the Scottish Human Rights Commission in particular has developed. I think that's something that Citizens Advice Scotland would like to see increasingly applied to decisions about social security spending. So if you are not already aware of it, I would certainly kind of recommend that that's something that the committee may want to look into in future.
Thank you. Now, just before we move on, Rachel's got a suggestion. Now, Rachel, it's not a question. I'm going to let you immediately move on to Pauline McNeil after that for theme 3. Rachael Hamilton.
Actually, to drill down, and if there was any information that we could receive, because the annex document that accompanied the Scottish Government explanation of uprating from CPI to double lock actually states the costings, but what it doesn't state, and whether I'm missing this, is actually the transition. So instead of bringing it in from April 2022, bringing it, as the panel have discussed, from April 2021. And I would like to see that, because currently it's just looking from 22 up to 25. Thank you.
Okay, and we have to leave that sitting there. If witnesses want to write to us on that, we'll be very grateful. Our Deputy Convener next, Pauline McNeil.
I'm just going to wrap up all my questions, Robin, so you don't need to call me in theme 4. That's helpful. Wanted to ask the panel, Morag and John, first of all, whether the process for payments has struck the right balance between administrative considerations and the needs of payments. So you're concerned about the frequency of payments being 4 weeks in arrears. So wanted to get you to put something on the record about your concerns. Also, if I could ask you your concerns about the fact that the payment won't be backdated. I thought Morag and John might want to answer these ones.
Okay, so let's go to Morag Green first. I'll take John Shaw after that.
Yeah, sure, thank you. So I think that on the question of frequency, the committee will be aware that the other kind of benefits have kind of differing frequency of payments, and universal credit in particular has, which eventually all recipients of Scottish Child Payment as it's currently set out should be on, has the Scottish Choice option of allowing people to receive their 2 monthly payments rather than once a month. And our evidence suggests that more frequent payments is a really kind of powerful tool for helping families on low incomes to manage their money. And I think that, my understanding is that the Scottish Child Payment in the first instance is going to be delivered on a monthly basis or a 4-weekly basis, because administratively that's easier, and it makes it kind of possible to kind of bring the payment in more quickly. But yeah, in our submission, this is something again that we've asked for Scottish Government to keep under review and to look at whether there's kind of flexibility to allow families to have more frequent payments in future. I suppose the other kind of thing that's kind of linked to this is around the kind of question of automation, and our understanding from the kind of the breadth of expertise that we have from across the network is that the kind of most significant barriers to people taking up payments such as the Scottish Child Payment is awareness about the payment, but also the kind of complexity of the kind of process for accessing that benefit. And again, that's something that we have asked Scottish Government to consider on an ongoing basis, is how the kind of process of getting onto Scottish Child Payment can be automated.
John Shaw?
Yeah, absolutely agree. I think it's interesting to read the response to SCOS on this, where it says that there wasn't a clear majority in favour of 4 weekly payments, but there was not a clear majority in favour of anything, which sort of reinforces the idea that it's better to give people a choice about what works for them. And I think the 4 weekly cycle is partly linked to universal credit assessment periods and minimising overpayments, which comes back to this issue of being tied to entitlement. And I certainly think Morag raises a really important point, because to touch on the second part of Pauline's question, you don't need to have a rule for backdating if your payment automatically starts on the same day as your qualifying benefit starts. So it's kind of an alternative approach. If you don't need to apply because it automatically gets paid to you, then there isn't such an injustice in people not having realised and losing out on money as a result of that.
Do you want to come back in, Pauline?
Yes, if you don't mind. Thank you very much. I wanted to further ask about the question of automation, which has been ruled out for the time being. And I wondered if you thought that, I don't know what difference it would make. I take the points made by John and Morag that most people would like the choice of the frequency of the payment. I don't know if it makes any difference in terms of the administration if you did it fortnightly or monthly, but if it was easier for a monthly payment to be automated, if that was the case, is that a compromise that might be worth making in the long run? And how important do you think automation of the benefit is in terms of the whole policy of tackling poverty?
Okay, who'd like to come in first on that one? Maybe, I was just going to say maybe Anne, because you didn't get the opportunity to answer the last question. Anne Baldock.
I think if the automation would come in sooner, if it was kept as the monthly payment, I think it would be worth doing that. Having the payments automated, the applications automated, I think would make a big difference, especially around take-up. For example, Glasgow City Council, with their school clothing grants, moved to an automated system because there was a large number of people who weren't applying for it, and it resulted in 97% take-up. So there has to be an advantage in automating the system so that more people would be able to access it. Regarding the frequency of payments, it would be good if it could be looked at, just to make it easier, because there's still a large number of parents are on the legacy benefits. They tend to get the payments spread over different things, like child benefit will be weekly, ESA maybe fortnightly, tax credits could be monthly, and that's how they budget. So the ability to request different payment frequencies would help.
Thank you very much. And John Shaw?
Yeah, I think it's going to be really important to come back to this in the review. And I think automation is a word which could mean a number of different things. We've got the child winter heating assistance, where children in Scotland will not have to apply because the data will automatically be passed to Social Security Scotland. Obviously, that's a one-off annual payment, so it's a much simpler thing. I think when we're considering Scottish child payment further in the future, certainly the first time I read about the top-up power, I sort of envisaged that somebody at DWP would press some buttons on the computer which would spit out an extra £20 a week for each child in Scotland, rather than setting up a separate application system. And we absolutely support what the Scottish Government has done to introduce Scottish child payment as soon as possible. But when we get to that point of taking a breath and reviewing it, I think it's important to note that, if you want 100% take up, automation is the way to go. Or if you want to be able to get beyond the problems with those qualifying benefits, then decoupling the power to pay the Scottish child payment from requirement for entitlement to a reserve benefit, with all of the difficulties and complexities that brings for claimants, is going to be something which should definitely be on the table when looking at the longer term future of the payment.
Okay, thank you, John. Pauline, do you have another question before we move on?
Very much, no, nothing.
Okay, thank you. Can we move to Mark Griffin, MSP now?
Thanks, Camina. I just wanted to carry on that theme of take-up and just ask the panel whether they feel that the government's plans for communicating about the benefit and promoting take-up are sufficient, and whether there's anything else the government can be doing to boost that level of take-up.
Morag Green, do you want to come in next?
Yeah, so I suppose, I think kind of clear communications about the benefit are going to be critical in terms of take-up, and also in terms of managing the kind of issue where children will become ineligible at sex because we won't
You don't have to.
Sorry, I was speaking. Can people hear me? I've got some people nodding, but yeah, okay. So yeah, I think kind of clear communication about the benefit is going to be critical, because people need to be aware of it, and that's one of the kind of biggest kind of barriers that we're aware of to people accessing payments such as this. I think that it will also be kind of critical around the kind of potential for or the fact that children will kind of fall out of the system when they turn 6 years old, so that families are aware of that and anticipate that and plan their budgets accordingly. One thing that I think tends to kind of be very helpful from a kind of advice provision perspective, if we have as much, Citizens Advice Scotland, and I'm sure the same applies to other advice agencies, have as much information about the detail of the payment in advance of it going live, so that we can make sure that our advice pages are up to date and that our advisors know the detail of the payment and how it's going to work, and so that they can support people through that process. I think we've kind of gotten to the position with the agency where we tend to have a good relationship in place, where we get that information in a timely fashion. We are able to make sure that that's out to the network. But yeah, I think that's a kind of an important mechanism for supporting take-up.
Thank you, Morag. I think everyone could hear you with the exception of myself. I lost my internet connection, but that's me back up and running now, so sorry for the confusion there. I'll take John Shaw next.
So yeah, I think absolutely what Morag says about information being available to advisors is really, really important. It's going to be something that local authorities have a really important role in as well. So as part of our work with Glasgow on their child poverty strategy, it's good to see that they're thinking about that as a way of contributing to reducing child poverty. And I think the other thing is looking at the effectiveness of the Best Start grants take-up prompt letters, which I think Mark Griffin's been asking some questions about and is clearly interested in. So seeing how effective that's been. And something that struck me last night is also thinking about things which are going to people already, rather than having to do a separate letter. And one of the things I noted down was write it on the side of the baby box, which I realise that's potentially not exactly how you would choose to do it, because it's got a very nice design. But thinking about those situations in which to be contacted anyway at a point just before, at the point where they're becoming entitled. And I suppose another one might be universal credit. We know that there is a notification sent to everybody in Scotland about the Scottish choices at the end of their first assessment period. So that's something which is already automatically sent out to everyone who lives in Scotland. So it wouldn't deal with the issue of losing a month's entitlement by the time you're told about it, but it would be a way of sweeping up some people who might not have realised there is this new payment as well. So I think looking at things where parents are already being contacted is a really good way to go with this.
Okay, thank you. Anne Baldock?
Again, I would agree with everything that my colleague said. We were quite heavily involved when the Best Start grant was being designed and delivered, and a lot of our parents were consulted over how it would be delivered and about publicising it. And we have already had some discussions about the Scottish Child Payment. And I think, again, getting that message out is key. And I think third sector organisations and other statutory organisations will be a big help in being able to promote the Scottish Child Payment. The Scottish Government have put a lot of work into publicising the previous benefits that have come out, especially the Best Start grant. And And I think if they do the same with the Scottish Child Payment, it will increase the take-up.
Thank you, Anne. I know Mark Griffin wants to come back in with a couple of questions. I hate asking you to do this, Mark. Could you try and roll them together if you can, just for time constraints?
Yep, I will do. Thanks, Convener. Initially, the Scottish Government set a target of 85% uptake to meet its policy ambition of lifting 30,000 children out of poverty, and I realise that's somewhat out of date because that was pre-pandemic. But just to ask members of the panel whether they think there's any value for setting target in legislation for uptake that would then trigger a review if that target was not met. And then secondly, just to ask if the panel think there is any issue with potential scammers taking advantage of people during the application process, as we've seen with Universal Credit, where people have offered support to help with the application and then taken full advance payments and have left people having to pay those back. If anyone's got any views on those two issues. Thanks, Convener.
That's helpful, Mr. Griffin. I'll take all three witnesses in. You can answer either or both. Don't feel the need to answer both. Maybe another witness can pick up the other one. Should we go to John Shaw first, please?
I think the easiest way to avoid those kind of scams around people purporting to help with applications is kind of linked, because if 100% of the children in Scotland who are eligible for the Scottish Child Payment are already getting it paid to the correct person, then there's simply no space for that scam to exist in. So I think the two are linked together. In terms of the question on statutory target for take-up, it's an interesting one. I suppose we do have the child poverty reduction targets, which Parliament is going to be held to account for already. It's a question I haven't really had a chance to think through, so it might be best to write if we think of anything else on that. But I suppose I'm struggling to see what the addition of a separate take-up target in addition to the child poverty target would add to Parliament's tools to hold the government to account on this.
Thanks, John. You're allowed to think about it and get back to us, absolutely. Anne, do you want to come in next?
Again, I agree with John. I haven't really thought about, the idea of a set target. I think that there are checks in place for the avoidance of fraud to the same extent that you see with Universal Credit. Because there's an application and then there's a double check on benefit entitlement, but there is always going to be a certain amount of fraudulent claims. But I don't think there's an awful lot can be done about that. But it's something that should maybe be continuously reviewed.
Okay, thanks, Anne. And we will now go to Morag.
Yeah, again, like others, I don't think we've got a position on a kind of statutory target for uptake, but it's certainly something we can kind of take away and consider. I think on the kind of question of scammers, as well as what has already been said about the importance of automation, because obviously the kind of more payment is automated, the less scope there is for scamming. If that's not in place, then the kind of role of independent advice and information for people is really clear, so that they understand how to apply for the payment themselves, and that the kind of that process for applying is straightforward and easy, so that they don't kind of fall into the trap of feeling that they need to get support from somebody who is not a kind of independent advice agency. And I think on the kind of general issue of scams, it's something that obviously we're quite aware of at Citizens Advice Scotland, and I think it's not something that should kind of prevent the kind of payment of social security, but it's something obviously that the agency will need to be constantly vigilant about, in the same way that DWP is constantly vigilant about scams on Universal Credit.
Thank you very much, Morag. Can we move to, thank you, Mr Griffin. Can we move to Jeremy Balfour now?
Thank you. Good morning, Convener, and thank you to the panel. I've just got a couple of questions, and again, just because of time, I'll put them together. Obviously, people will be applying for this in November, but they'll have to wait 3 months before they get the money. Are you concerned that people fully understand that, and how do we get that information out? And secondly, and this picks up, I think, a point made earlier, do you see still the opportunity for Scottish Government, if they have the will, to use something like the best grant payment for that 3 month period so that people aren't out of pocket? Or would you see it being backdated with a larger payment made when the first payment is made, which would be the better way forward? Back for everybody. Sorry, Davina.
Okay, if someone wants to indicate who'd like to go first, or I can just pick someone. I always feel bad when I pick someone to go first. I get the less amount of chance to actually think about it. And, John Shaw's bid saved everyone else. Mr Shaw.
So I think, yeah, the question about how clear things are going to be during that initial period is really going to depend on what people are told about it by the Scottish Government, and that's perhaps more a matter for the communication with applicants than for the regulations. I think, picking up again on Morag's point, one way of making sure that's really clear is making sure that there is publicly available guidance to underpin those regulations available as soon as they're enforced, so that advisors have those tools once they've been produced by people like Citizens Advice Scotland and ourselves to make sure that there is information out there to help people navigate it. On Mr Balfour's second question about backdate versus Best Start grant, I suppose what I was scribbling down when we were talking about Best Start grant is the issue that the Best Start grant is a lump sum payment and is made at certain points in a child's life. So there won't be a possibility of using that mechanism for children who are just not in the right age window during the period from November to February. A backdated lump sum, it doesn't appear that the government has any intention to do that, but that would certainly appear to be the way to actually fully mitigate the delay between applications opening in November and payments being made in February. So between those two options, absolutely allowing a lump sum backdated payment to November would be the way to go. I think it's not something that's provided for in the regulations, but I guess amending regulations could come into force before February to provide for that.
Thanks, John. Anne Baldock.
Yeah, there's nothing in the regulations about doing a backdate. I think the November window for applications is more to do with the Social Security being able to cope with the number of applications there's going to be. And I think, as John was saying, key to it is going to be how it's promoted and the support that's given to organisations who support parents, so that they have the tools to be able to get the message out there. In the past, with the Best Start grant, there was a lot of work put in beforehand, and as long as that is in and the government work with third sector organisations, it should make it easier, but it will be difficult to get the message across that, you know, the sooner you apply the better, but you're not actually going to get a payment till February. But I doubt very much if there's a possibility of having a backdate. The amount that would cost, I don't think would be considered. So yeah, it comes down to us all working together to promote it as much as possible.
Thanks, Anne. Can I take Morag Green now?
Yeah, I don't have much to add to what's already been said. And just to kind of reiterate Anne's point, our understanding is that kind of 3 month window is to prevent a kind of bottleneck of applications, because this will be the biggest kind of administrative task that the agency has undertaken so far in terms of getting payment up and running. And I think the idea of backdating the payment is a really nice one, and it would undoubtedly make an impact upon people's finances. But yeah, I think it comes down to that, back to the kind of question of budget priorities and whether or not the money's available to do that or not.
Thank you, Morag, and thank you for rolling those questions up together, Mr. Balfour. That was very helpful. Can we go to James Dornan now?
There was a number of issues which have been mentioned already about the likes of the backdated money, which has just been mentioned there, and also around being awarded a reserve. Being awarded a reserve benefit but not receiving the payment, can you still be entitled to the Scottish Child Payment, as being issues that need clarification? I was wondering if any of the witnesses have any other suggestions of areas in which maybe clarification or regulation, further regulation, would be required.
A good technical question as we approach the end of the evidence session, Mr. Dornan. This is me filibustering to give our witnesses the opportunity to check their answer. Mr. Shaw, first off the mark again. John Shaw.
I love a technical question. So yeah, in our submission, we do just pick up on a couple of those. So one of those is where a couple are jointly receiving child tax credit or universal credit, because both of those parents will be claimants of that benefit, and there doesn't appear to be a mechanism in the regulations to decide between an application made by each parent where they live together, they claim means tested benefits jointly. That's obviously going to be rare because the vast majority of parents will be able to agree between themselves, but it is just a tiny detail where we can't quite see how the priority rules are intended to operate. And I know that the tribunal system does like some legal certainty around exactly what should happen in every situation. And it's a bit less about the child payment regulations themselves, but we also touched on the fact that there is a welcome change to the rules around when you can be awarded a Scottish child payment following an award of a qualifying benefit. But that does bring the Scottish child payment regulation slightly out of step with the Best Start grant and the funeral support payment regs. And SCOS have certainly commented on the preference for identical wording where the policy intent is essentially identical. So I think it would be good to see the Best Start grant and funeral support payment regulations brought exactly into line in order to make it more consistent and less confusing for families. So those are the immediate two that spring to mind.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Do any other witnesses want to come in and add anything to that? Okay, I don't see anything. So Alison Johnston's indicated that she's got another question. I'm trying to, and appealing to it's going to be very short. If you could try and make it as short as possible, Alison, because I've got a mop-up question as well. I'm trying to sneak in relation to our committee inquiry. Alison, over to you.
Thank you, convener. It was just, James Dornan kicked off this important discussion. It's just the fact that the child payment has a double take-up issue, because we do need to make sure that people apply for the qualifying benefit and for the child payment itself. So I just wanted to understand if witnesses are of the view that enough has been done to raise awareness of this issue, if there are plans in place to tackle this.
Oh, sorry. My apologies, the convener was trying to multitask there. IT was coming to check my connection so I could continue to chair the committee, but I see has Mr. Shaw come in to bid to answer that one again? Or is that an old icon in the chat? I think you're at anyway, John Shaw. You can come in first.
So yeah, that was an old bid. I think the question of take up of reserve benefits is a really important one, and it's a really complicated one as well. What we've seen is lots of people claiming universal credit during the early stages of the pandemic and being worse off, and that sort of reinforces the need for good quality, well-funded information and advice services at the point where people are thinking about whether they need to claim benefits. And yeah, I think there's always more that can be done, and it's going to be really important that the Scottish Government, local authorities and the UK Government work together on that in order to make sure that everyone's getting the money that they're entitled to.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shaw. Anne Baldock?
Again, agree with everything that John said. I think it will be vital to ensure that advice agencies are able to provide ongoing advice to make sure that UK benefits are claimed, and work together as much as possible with other organisations.
Thank you, Anne. And Morag Green.
Yeah, just to echo the importance of independent advice on this again, Social Security is the biggest issue that we see across our network, and of that, universal credit is the biggest benefit that we give advice on. I think there's kind of particular things to kind of be aware of in raising awareness of universal credit, and one of them obviously is the kind of 5-week wait for the first payment. So I think, like, from our evidence, it looks like a lot of people wait until they've kind of ran out of money before they make the application, and then have 5 weeks wait, which is obviously very kind of difficult to manage. But the other pitfall is if you apply too soon and then you receive a kind of final salary or whatever in the kind of qualifying period, it can effectively wipe out your first payment of universal credit. So there's a kind of sweet spot in terms of the right time to make a universal credit claim, and I think it's important that people are aware of that, and that we raise awareness of that.
Thank you, Morag. We're almost at the end of our evidence session. It's a really fascinating evidence session, but I suppose a slight concern I have, and I say this as someone who's incredibly supportive of the Scottish Child Payment, and I previously mentioned the Give Me 5 campaign previously, which was universal and had significant costs, and the Scottish Government took a policy decision to give double that amount of cash, but to target it to those most at risk of poverty or living in poverty. Now, there's always a balance between targeted benefits and universal benefits, but I'm also conscious this is a top-up benefit, and the core responsibility for those in need who require benefits still sits with a UK government, and there's demands on a UK government, and quite rightly on a Scottish government also, to maximise the income of those most in need. And whilst I welcome the attention on the Scottish Child Payment and how we can improve it, how we could pay more, how we operate it, the slight concern is that others in another Parliament may decide that when there's not a sufficiency in benefits at a reserve level, at a Westminster level, then the solution isn't to fix that. The solution is just in a budget, as we've already spoken about, that is restricted in this Parliament, is to continue to top up benefits or create new benefits, not necessarily with the resources to sustain that. Now, I'm not trying to draw you on that to say anything political, but I think that's quite an important lead-in to a social security inquiry that we've currently got a call for evidence on in relation to how Scottish social security system can act quickly and fleet of foot to help those in poverty, most at risk of poverty, because of the impact of COVID-19 and the economic crisis around that. So it's to draw that to your attention, but also as part of that inquiry, we're looking at the barriers and issues in relation to the interaction with the Scottish and the UK system. So I wouldn't be doing my job properly if I didn't draw that to the attention of witnesses in the context of the Scottish Child Payment. You can make a reflection on that just now. I hope you'll submit to the inquiry. It's not about putting pressure on the Scottish Government versus the UK Government. It's how we can use the social security systems as effectively as possible to meet the huge increase in need that we're all anticipating due to COVID-19. So please do respond to that call for evidence the committee's put out, and I'll just give witnesses the opportunity to make any final comments. They can respond to what I've said there, or they can make any final comments that you wish to make before we move into private session. and we'll maybe start with Morag Green.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, the kind of adequacy of social security in the current circumstances to support people to kind of weather the economic storm that's been created by the what started out as a health crisis is something that we have been grappling with at Citizens Advice Scotland in recent months, and we absolutely will be putting in a submission to the inquiry that you've just mentioned. I think that it's kind of right that we kind of need to think about the kind of situation in the whole, because the majority of social security is reserved to the kind of United Kingdom Parliament still, and I think the inquiry and also the work that Scottish Government are doing on social renewal and recovery from COVID presents a kind of a unique opportunity to think about how Scottish Government uses the social security powers that they have to really kind of protect people from that storm. So yes, we will be submitting to that inquiry, and we are also participating in the social renewal process to contribute to that very important discussion. And thank you very much for inviting me along to give evidence today.
Thank you, Morag. Anne Baldock.
The number of people who are now eligible for the Scottish Child Payment has obviously increased dramatically due to the increase in the number of people taking up universal credit, because sadly they have been made redundant. This will only get worse as time goes on, especially when furlough ends in October. The Scottish Child Payment is going to be a lifeline for a lot more than was anticipated, and unfortunately that leads to a huge increase in costs. I think that the Scottish Government's continued request from the UK Government to look at their benefits that are still in their power will make a significant contribution to putting pressure on them to try and increase the actual benefits, as well as hopefully persuade them to give more money towards the devolved payments.
Thank you very much, Anne. And John Shaw. Oh, sorry, Anne. My apologies. Just hold a second, John. Anne, did I cut you off unduly there just before? Were you going to say something else there?
It's fine. No, I was just going to thank the committee for allowing me to come along and talk this morning on behalf of OPFS.
We're very grateful that you did. Sorry for just cutting you off at the end there, and John Shaw.
I suppose I should get my thanks in first, so I don't forget to at the end. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. And what struck me was thinking about things like deductions from benefits. And there's obviously been a lot of cross-party, I think it's fair to say, concern about the level of deductions which are made from universal credit to recover advances or to recover other debts and the level of hardship that's been caused there. And it's reminded me of something that I forgot to say coming back to the child payment regulations, that Scottish Government have clearly left a lot of flexibility here and have taken the power to reduce the Scottish child payment to zero without consent in order to recover an overpayment of either the Scottish child payment or another devolved benefit. And certainly I think there's an interesting difference in approach between the Westminster Government and the Scottish Government, which is a choice which those two governments can make. But we would certainly say that given everyone who's entitled to the Scottish child payment is already on a low income and has been means tested by the UK government, it's difficult to envisage a situation in which it will be appropriate to reduce that payment to zero in order to recover an overpayment. So certainly we think that the regulations could be improved with some legal protection around a minimum amount of Scottish child payment that must still be paid to make sure there is money still going to those families, and Short of that, in the initial period, it will be really important that guidance is clear that the Scottish Government don't consider that it's ever going to be appropriate to completely stop someone's payment without consent. And that will help advisors as well, because they'll be able to point out to families, even if they feel that moral obligation to repay some money due to a mistake they've made, which tends to be the most common situation, it'll be really helpful if we can just point them to something saying, look, it's quite clear that Social Security Scotland won't force you to repay this money due to the hardship you're already in. So yeah, it's a reflection on the different ways we do things, but also something which I feel is quite important about these regulations we're looking at this morning as well. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Shaw. I think that leaves us to thank you now. It was kind of the witnesses to come and thank us for the opportunity to give evidence. Actually, we should be thanking you, because it's our job to scrutinise the Scottish Child Payment, and you've helped us immensely in being able to do that. So thank you for your time. Thank you for bearing with us with a few technical problems we had with the link this morning as well. And as Rachael Hamilton and others have said, if there's any additional information you want to send us, drop us an email, drop us a letter. The clerks stand ready to take that information. So can I thank all our witnesses for this morning's evidence session, and we'll now move to agenda item 3 that we've already agreed to take in private. If I could ask members to stay on this link, please, just for a few moments before we move to the other platform, that would be helpful. We're going to move into private session.